Have you ever suffered from uncontrollable cravings? Then watch on. So it's very rare for me to go through any week with clients without talking about the big C. And by the big C, what we're talking about is cravings. So I'm sure that if you've been on any sort of diet plan in the past, is that you've experienced cravings of some kind. Now, in today's video, we're not going to be talking about cravings, but I'll just give you a quick brief introduction to what a craving is. So for me, when we're talking about cravings, we're talking about an urge for a certain food, whether it be sugary, whether it be savoury, but we're talking about an urge for a certain food. And really the big thing when it comes to cravings is that they're difficult to manage, mainly because they can be biological, in terms of they can be hormonally induced, but also they can be psychological as well, and lifestyle as well. So what you'll tend to find with cravings is that there's many different factors that will interfere and actually cause people to crave different things. But what I want to talk about in today's video is this whole idea of a trigger food. Now, not everybody has issues with trigger foods, so if you've never heard of the term, then it may not apply to you at all. But having come from an overweight background myself, I had huge issues with trigger foods, which I think really contributed to actually me getting overweight in the first place. So what is a trigger food? Well, for me, a trigger food is the type of food that you eat and then either eat it uncontrollably afterwards, or it leads to other type of binge behaviour around other sorts of foods. And trigger foods don't actually just give you issues in terms of calories. So if it's a diet you're trying to stick to, they're not just going to give you issues there in terms of actually managing your weight, but actually the issue they're going to give you is generally a lot of trouble more in the psychological sense, that normally there's going to be feelings induced of shame and as we feeling induced of guilt and all these sorts of things as well. So trigger foods can have a really powerful impact, not just on how much weight you're losing, but also how you're feeling in yourself as you lose those weights as well. Now, trigger foods can come from anywhere. I know for me, having done a hell of a lot of work on identifying my trigger foods, as I actually lost over 100 pounds, is I know things like chocolate, I know things like alcohol, I know things like ice cream, I know things like pizza, I know things like peanut butter. All are trigger foods for me. They're foods that if I start eating them, either they're going to make me eat more of them and in quantities that would be normally considered ridiculous, or they'll actually affect my diet in the long term by actually making me crave certain other foods that won't contribute to my weight loss goal. And having worked with many clients who have also suffered with trigger food issues over the years, is that it can be absolutely anything. Of course, there's some foods such as broccoli and kale, which most people would not consider trigger foods, but I've worked with lots of people where some foods that they would consider a trigger definitely wouldn't be on my trigger list. And this is the whole idea of why it's so important to be able to identify the triggers that are currently in your diet. So I read a book, I reckon I read this book probably a good 10 years ago. It's actually when I was towards the end of my own weight loss journey, and I was actually really trying to manage my own emotions around eating, actually getting used to living in this slim body that I'd managed to create for myself, which I was finding quite difficult at the time. But the book was called Hungry, and it's a book that I would definitely recommend anybody to read who's either going through a weight loss journey themselves or has been through it and they're just trying to manage almost the aftermath of cravings and managing their body and actually managing their emotions around food as well. It's a really great book. But in this book, what the author was basically saying about trigger foods was that really the whole idea about getting around them and being able to win against the trigger foods is that first of all you have to have some sort of level of mindfulness in place. That was mindfulness, not mindfulness. Okay, so you need to have some sort of level of mindfulness in place. What we mean by this whole idea of mindfulness is that you need to start becoming aware of what these triggers are first and foremost, so that you can manage them best and create strategies from there on. And the way that he recommended to manage trigger foods best, which I found really useful for me at the time, was to implement this whole idea of the traffic light. So that's what I'm going to share with you today, is the traffic light system to manage your cravings and manage your trigger foods to help you get better results than faster before without any sort of feeling of shame, without any sort of feeling of guilt. Okay? So let's talk about this whole idea that he shared on the traffic light system. So his whole idea was that you can colour code your foods to work out which ones are going to be causing you issues and which ones won't be. So the whole idea was that obviously on a traffic light you've got three different lights. You've got a red light at the top, you've got a yellow or an amber light, and then you've got a green light. Obviously, red, danger, stop, okay? That's going to be trigger foods that you definitely know that you cannot handle, okay? AKA, if you eat those foods, you're going to get into uncontrollable levels of hunger, uncontrollable levels of cravings, and you're probably going to eat uncontrollably too. These foods sit in that category. If they're amber, these are the sort of foods that perhaps cause you issues sometimes, but definitely not all the time. They might be situational dependent, for example. And green foods, they're the all-go foods. Just like on a traffic light, it means go. It means you can eat as much as you like of those, and they normally will not cause you any sort of issue, whether it's going to be psychological or biological. But the whole point that he made around it as well is that trigger foods are normally not the issue solely in themselves, aka it's not just the food that's going to be the issue. He also mentioned that it can be behavioural as well, or situational based, meaning that actually in certain situations we tend to eat foods and get a bit uncontrollable about eating, and in some situations we don't. So his whole idea was the idea is that you actually go through the red, amber and green as well for behavioural sort of eating too, to work out what are the situations that perhaps cause you to overeat, what are the situations that don't. And actually being able to identify what are your red light situations, your amber light situations and your green light situations. So red perhaps being, I don't know, going out with friends. That might be a situational issue for you that causes you to overeat or causes you to feel guilty, causes you to feel shameful. Amber is going to again be something where maybe in some situations it's okay, some situations it isn't, but green, generally you can eat happily all the time. There's never going to be any sort of issues of overeating or shame or guilt or any of those sorts of things as well. And his whole idea was that once you had actually ranked your trigger foods first of all, so the actual foods that have been causing you issue into red, amber and green, and once you've actually organised the situational factors or the behavioural factors that go into red, amber and green, you've suddenly got mindfulness of your situation. You've suddenly got an idea of what to work with. You've suddenly got an idea of where to make your strategies from. And that can be completely empowering on your journey to actually help you move forwards and feel like you've got some control over this whole craving or overeating or binge eating or whatever it might be. But what does it mean if you've got a load of red light foods and a load of red light behaviours? Well, for a recovering overweight person, aka someone who's lost a hell of a lot of weight, who is still suffering from a lot of cravings, still suffering from a lot of psychological issues when it comes around food, is that much like any addict, is that actually the best thing to do is to abstain. And although here at Accelerate it's something that I try to avoid people doing, mainly because normally when you abstain from something you tend to come back a couple of weeks later or a couple of months later and completely binge on the things that you've been abstaining from, actually for a recovering overweight person is that abstinence can be one of the most powerful things you do in order to stop you reverting or backloading yourself back to where you were before you started. So sometimes abstinence can be a good thing. But identifying what are these things that you need to abstain from first and foremost can be an extremely empowering part of your journey and help you control everything so that you can understand where this shame and guilt is coming from and how you can avoid it at all costs. Then you've got the yellows. These are the kind of the almost intermediate factors, the things that sometimes they're okay, sometimes they're not. In these situations, you'll normally be okay with some yellows in your diet. So if you've identified as a behavioural thing that perhaps going out eating with friends is a yellow for you, then it's okay. Go out from time to time and enjoy yourself. You can handle it. You've currently got the skill set to be able to deal with it. And if it's green, of course, it's an all-go. They're free foods. But what is this whole traffic light system really teaching us at the end of the day? Well, first of all, as we know when you're on a weight loss mission, is that it's going to be calorie controlled anyway. Is that obviously if you're eating too many calories, you're not going to lose weight. Whereas if you're actually in a calorie deficit, aka you're burning more calories than you consume, you're probably going to lose weight as well. But you can be on any sort of plan and it should work for weight loss. But what this whole idea is almost suggesting to us is that when it comes to your trigger foods, or when you're coming to building a diet, is you want to abstain from any sort of trigger foods in the diet that you're creating for yourself. Okay, so you've got to abstain from those foods because they're the foods that are going to cause you issues, are going to cause you to go into calorie surpluses and probably get you to store your weight at some point or not lose it in the way that you desired. But building a diet plan around yellow foods and yellow behaviours and green foods and green behaviours, that gives you a diet where you can actually comfortably live without any form of guilt, any form of shame. You can enjoy the process as much as you can. And also what you'll find is you'll probably get the best results out of it at the end. So this video today was all about this whole idea of trigger foods. Okay, have you got any trigger foods in your diet? Have you got any trigger situations or trigger behaviors that are leading you to overeat? Well, that's where I would start. Before you do anything else with your nutritional plan, before you look at calories, before you look at macros, before you look at anything, if you've got some issues with food in particular, start ranking them on this scale. Are they red, which means no go, we need to abstain from them? Are they yellow, which means sometimes we can keep them in, sometimes we can't? Are they green, they're all go? The more greens you've got in that initial plan, the more likely you are to stick to it, and the more likely you are to get fantastic results.